So it's a great honour to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I work for the Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Bangor University and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in Sweden. I spend most of my time sat behind a computer, so it's very nice to get outdoors and to visit such a beautiful country, so it's a great opportunity. I'm going to talk to you today about my involvement with knowledge brokering in the form of systematic reviews. So we're faced on a daily basis with information, some of which looks quite reliable and some of which doesn't. The cosmetics industry is particularly guilty of this, from skin rejuvenating creams that work on the DNA level, creams that are inspired by the science of genes, and this particular one that's terrifying that actually involves DNA repair. But it really highlights that some information is clearly not very reliable. And then we move on to the contradictory. We're also faced with information that can seemingly contradict itself. This one example with red wine, for anybody who's familiar with the Daily Mail's approach to sensationalist journalism, you'll see on a daily basis that you get information telling you at one stage that something's toxic and one stage that it'll save your life. And red wine is no different. Apparently drinking 1 glass of red wine can increase our rate of cancer, but drinking half a glass of red wine protects us. So heaven forbid we find some happy medium. But actually, if you look at these, the research on red wine over time, it's fluctuating backwards and forwards. It's quite interesting. But even information that can be seen on its own particularly reliable can contradict itself, and it's very difficult to know what's believable. And then we move on to the unevidenced. I don't know if people are familiar with this, this case study, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2010 released a rather unfortunate report that claimed that the Himalayan glaciers would melt away by 2035. And it was rapidly realized by experts on glacial retreat that that level of melt was physically impossible. And on closer, which is good, on closer inspection, it appeared to be a rather embarrassing mistake. And you can see a quote from the report that confusingly states both that the Himalayas would disappear by 2035, but also reduce to 20%, which in the same sentences, or the penultimate sentence, the next sentence is rather confusing to have two very different statements. But this citation, if you follow it back, goes back to a WWF report, which itself then quotes a New Scientist interview with a scientist who, I think probably rather flippantly in an interview, said that most of the glaciers in the Himalayan region will vanish within 40 years as a result of global warming. And that made its way back into an IPCC report, which is quite worrying. And since Syed Hossain, who made that perhaps throwaway comment, has retracted it, the WWF has retracted their report. And it's clearly a situation where there's a need for reliable evidence. Sometimes when we have an evidence need, primary research, so a research study can be undertaken to answer that research need, to answer that question. In other situations, perhaps because there's controversy, perhaps there's uncertainty, there may be a really strong need for reliability, or there may be a very pressing concern. That means that primary research may not be feasible. It may cost too much, it may take too much time, or it may be too small in terms of context to answer our question. In those situations, it may be appropriate, if sufficient evidence already exists, to undertake a review of the existing literature. And this is where knowledge brokering comes in. Brokering knowledge from the literature to the person with the evidence need. And there are obviously some interesting barriers to this transmission of scientific knowledge. And if anybody's able to come to the evidence-based conservation session this afternoon in Cartloofs, the room just next door, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, it promises to be a very exciting 2 sessions on discussing barriers to knowledge exchange. So please do come along to that. Traditional reviews are probably the method that we're all familiar with, or most of us will be familiar with, in terms of answering an evidence need in the literature. But they're subject to a number of key biases, which you may or may not be aware of. Selection bias is probably the most obvious one, that traditional reviews may purposefully select individual studies to discuss. And typically that's not done in a very transparent way, but it may result in a very biased selection of the literature. Secondly, even if a search for literature is carried out, for example, using a search string, a couple of terms put in a database, that database may only catalogue a certain proportion of the literature. So it may even then be a biased representation of the total available information out there. Publication bias, some of you may be familiar with. Publication bias results from editorial and peer review, and actually author decisions about what is worthy of publication in academic journals. Typically, editors want their journals to sell. Peer reviewers want high quality research to be available, and they may be a little bit more negative on aspiring academics with their new research. That's my experience anyway. And the result is that what you see published in the literature may be an overestimation of effect sizes. So it may be the more exciting, the more positive, the more easily explained research, and the more novel research as well. And that may be pushing the average, if you think of it in terms of numbers, it may be pushing the average effect size up. And what you don't see is the research that perhaps is harder to explain, perhaps shows a negative result, or a non-significant result, or perhaps it's hard, perhaps that research may be repetitive. So if it's already repeating something that someone else has done, if it's wanting to validate that research, it's less likely to get published in academic literature. And publication bias typically results in things like PhD theses, master's theses, government reports that would otherwise have been published that aren't available in the academic databases and academic journals. And typically that's ignored by traditional reviews. In general, in traditional reviews, there's a lack of transparency. We're not able to see what methods people have used for selecting and for identifying their research. And there's also a problem with vote counting. Vote counting occurs where people tally up the numbers of positive and the numbers of negative results. And I've done it in literature reviews and never realized it was a problem until I started working in this area. But what vote counting does is it misses the intricate information in terms of the size of the effect. So you may have 3 positive and 3 negative results, but that doesn't mean that there's no effect or that there's a contradiction. Or if you find 3 positive and only 1 non-significant, it doesn't mean that the evidence is overwhelmingly positive. You're missing the magnitude of effect, and you're also risking missing studies that fail to find a significant result, but when they're pulled together, perhaps in a meta-analysis, could show a significant result. And quality bias refers to dealing with all studies as if they're the same quality. And we know that studies aren't all the same quality. We know that some research is better than others and it's more reliable than others. Discussion bias, finally, is the tendency for people to discuss perhaps research that's easy to explain in a review, or to discuss what they find the most interesting or the most significant. So there are clearly some biases there. So evidence reviews are the answer, or an attempt to answer those biases, to mitigate those biases. They include methods like systematic reviews, like systematic maps, rapid evidence assessments, quick scoping reviews, and synopses. My area of expertise is systematic reviews and systematic maps, so that's where I'm going to focus the rest of this talk. Systematic reviews were initially developed in medicine in the 1980s, and they were in response to a realization that there was a lot of high-quality randomized control trials that were studying a very similar thing. And there's a very famous case with corticosteroids that are given after a heart attack, that over 30 years of research into corticosteroids failed to find a significant result in individual studies. But when combined, there was a significant beneficial effect of corticosteroids that should really have been detected 10 years earlier. And those are 10 years of people who may have died as a result of not being given those corticosteroids. We don't have quite the same exciting example in conservation science, but there are cases where interventions may be given or they may not be given to try and conserve a species, and we don't know what the overall effect is. And in medicine, it's now routinely used to summarize evidence. There are thousands and thousands of systematic reviews being undertaken. And they're typically regarded as a gold standard for evidence synthesis in terms of helping people make decisions. In 2006, it was realized that this was a useful method for conservation, and that methodology was translated into conservation. It's also been widely used in other disciplines like social sciences, where it has actually a slightly longer history than in conservation. So what do systematic reviews do? Well, first of all, they aim to exhaustively search the literature, and speaking from the voice of experience, it really is exhaustive. The idea is to look for all available evidence on a topic. They're comprehensive, or they try to be comprehensive, and they do that by using multiple different databases to search for information. So typically, academic research is catalogued in databases, but those databases only cover a certain portion of the literature. They may just cover a few select journals, they may cover a few select subjects. And by searching for multiple databases, we are trying to ensure that even if there's some overlap, that we've got all of the academic literature there. They also involve searches for grey literature. And this is really important because we're trying, firstly, to mitigate publication bias, to try and get a real understanding of what the picture is rather than what's published, what is selected to be published, but also to include other forms of grey literature like government reports, organisational reports, reports from charities, people doing research whose priority isn't publication. Because the research that's published in academic publications is just what academics want to publish. There's lots of other research going on out there, and we want to try and make the best use of that. For the whole of systematic review methodology, the methods are transparent. So the methods are written up in sometimes tens or hundreds of pages of supplementary information. So if someone wants to know exactly what was done, they can go into those supplementary methodology files and find out why their one study was excluded or why a certain database was chosen. And that transparency is really one of the foundation stones of systematic reviews. We also try to weight studies, so to give more reliable studies more weight in analysis. That's typically done in meta-analysis quite easily, but it can also be done in qualitative analyses where you're combining not numbers, but words and text and people's views and that kind of thing. And importantly as well, all relevant studies are included in the synthesis, in the discussion, rather than just selecting what you think is more interesting. And here are just some stages of systematic review. And throughout these stages, transparency, repeatability, and objectivity are the three central tenets, really, to ensure that we have a really reliable review. And formulation of the question is important. It's important to involve stakeholders in that so that it's accepted as a review. Importantly, the protocol, the methods for the review is published. It's peer reviewed and published and made publicly available. So if people want to look at what methodology you're planning, they can, and they can give you advice and help you out. And then through searching, screening, extracting data, critically appraising it for its quality, synthesizing it and drawing that back into a final review, which is then peer-reviewed and published. And dissemination is also a really important thing with systematic review. So it's not enough just to produce a 150-page report and say, ta-da, there's your answer. It needs to be disseminated in the right format, given to the right people, and you need to make sure that they're given all the help that you can give them in terms of making a decision. So we saw earlier the problem with glacial melt in the Himalayas, and actually in 2013, Chris Miller published a systematic review on the evidence of glacial shrinkage, and if anybody's interested, that systematic review is available online. I found out yesterday, sadly, the IPCC report in 2014 ignored this systematic review, which is quite worrying, but the information's out there. I wanted to highlight some other systematic reviews quickly as well. One that looked at the components of biodiversity which influence poverty. One that looked at community-based conservation and its effects on attitudes, behaviours, on ecology and economics. And one that looked at what the impacts of urban agricultural programs were on food security in low and middle income countries. And those are some of the questions that these systematic reviews aim to answer. One in particular that I wanted to go into a little bit more detail was one that I helped to write last year. It was published on the human well-being impacts of terrestrial protected areas. And I don't have a huge amount of time to go into it in detail, but I'd be very interested in chatting to people if they're interested in coming and talking to us, because we're in the dissemination stage of this review. It was commissioned by the Science and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environmental Facility. And its scope was to have one arm of the review that looked qualitatively at individual studies that had aimed to assess people's views about protected areas, and one arm that looked quantitatively at studies that had aimed to actually measure those impacts. So two quite complementary but very separate review processes, one carried out in London and one carried out in Bangor. We identified just over 13,000 search results from 8 databases, 2 search engines and 33 organisational websites. And after reading those 13,248 titles, we were left with, I was left with, I did most of the reading, 1,683 abstracts, and then 210 full texts. So we read the 1,683 abstracts, and 210 full texts were deemed to be relevant. And that ended up with 79 studies that fit our inclusion criteria, and they had to be things that dealt with human well-being. They had to be terrestrial protected areas. In particular, STAP was interested in IUCN protected areas, but we included some others as well. So those 79 are studies that we thought could really help us to answer this question of what is the impact of terrestrial protected areas on human well-being. And the findings were, sadly, that the evidence base was quite poor. Studies in general were of generally poor quality. They were quite susceptible to bias. Typically, they had no replication. They were small scale and generally carried over very short time periods. A lot of the studies that were asking people's views or asking what resources people got from a protected area were carried out in quite leading ways. On top of that, the studies were quite variable. They were generally very incomparable when we tried to synthesize them. They were all measuring something slightly different. But there was some high-quality evidence of benefits. Some research from Paul Ferraro's group in Costa Rica and Thailand, for example, were undertaking studies across the country looking at the impact of protected areas on census data, measuring poverty indices. And that research is growing. And the quality is improving over time as well, which is good. One of the most interesting findings for me was that the arm of the study looking at qualitative assessment, so asking people's views, it showed impacts that weren't measured by the primary research in the quantitative side. So people were mentioning things like increased sexual aggression felt by women because men were having to leave home to go and work in new tourist centres around the park. And that wasn't studied quantitatively at all. Other things that shockingly weren't studied quantitatively at all were things like increased levels of disease caused by perhaps a new school that caused the school community to grow and bring in large numbers of new people. But all of those things weren't measured quantitatively. So we identified knowledge gaps, gaps in the evidence that we thought should really have been filled and to answer questions needed to be filled. So that identified a need for new primary research. We also identified improvements to study design. So rather than focusing on increasing the number of households, for example, in a study, you should increase the number of villages to make sure that actual true replication, where possible, is increased. But also that there's a need for support in monitoring and evaluation. And rather than just coming in and asking what's the impact of protected areas, STAP and GEF really needed to think carefully about what support they gave people in terms of monitoring their interventions. And if anybody's interested in that systematic review, both the STAP advisory report and the systematic review are freely available online, but I'm also available to chat if anybody's interested. So There have been some developments in systematic review methodology recently. Thanks very much. Systematic maps aim to catalogue and describe evidence. Qualitative synthesis, you've seen from the last systematic review, has been drawn in, and we're trying to make the most out of information rather than just saying, well, it's not looking at it quantitatively. We want to try and make the most out of the qualitative evidence available. And that's being done by multi-arm reviews that both look at quantitative and qualitative. And rapid reviews are a new method. I just put the cheater in because it was a bit of a boring slide, but it highlights that systematic reviews do generally take about between 1 and 2 years to do. They're a big undertaking because they're so rigorous, but there's a need to speed them up because evidence needs typically operate on faster timescales. There are some problems. Systematic reviews are a static snapshot. They're a snapshot of publications from the history from the last couple of years. The evidence must be documented, so it doesn't account for stakeholder and traditional knowledge, it doesn't account for expert knowledge, and it doesn't account for unreported studies. Dissemination is often limited, and that's because there are limited resources, so getting the information out once you've done your systematic review in the right format is really key. It's not enough just to produce a 150-page document. And this is where systematic reviews, I think, can come into their own in knowledge brokering. They can be combined with assessments of stakeholder knowledge and local ecological knowledge. They can be combined with assessments of expert knowledge as well. And they can be combined with economic evidence to really give an integrated assessment of the available evidence on a topic. They need to be put in socio-political context, and they need to be turned into living documents, so systematic reviews should really be added to as new information becomes available. And also tailored dissemination, you can see just an example of an infographic. Infographics are wonderful ways, although not without their risks, of displaying information in a very concise, rapid way. And from my experiences dealing with policymakers in the UK, they don't want to see a 150-page document. They don't even want to see a 2-page document. They want to see an infographic that gives them the information in about 2 minutes. And that's something that we're really interested in working in. But obviously all of this requires effort and resources. So thank you very much for your time.